I sometimes think back to the fall of 2019, when I drove past the old logging road outside a small town in northern Montana, the one that led to my ex-husband Aaron's cabin. I had no reason to go near it anymore, not after the divorce and the way things had gone between us, but life works in strange ways. That day, I had taken a longer route home from a work trip, trying to clear my head after a stressful week. The road curved through thick pine forests, and I wasn't fully paying attention until I realized exactly where I was. The turnoff to the cabin sat ahead like some half-forgotten scar in the landscape. I should have kept driving. My dog, Milo, was curled up in the back seat, half asleep, unaware of how heavy the air suddenly felt. I slowed down anyway, staring at the narrow dirt track that led deeper into the woods. I hadn't been out there in nearly 4 years. I told myself I didn't care about the place anymore, but something inside me twisted in a way I couldn't explain. Part unease, part unfinished tension I had tried for years to bury. Before I had time to think it through, I turned onto the road. Pine needles covered most of the ground, softening the sound of my tires. The trees leaned in close, their branches low and heavy from the autumn rain. The air smelled like wet soil, old bark, and something else I couldn't quite place. Milo lifted his head, ears up, nose twitching. That alone made my stomach knot. He was always alert in new places, but this wasn't new. Even he should have remembered the cabin from the handful of times we'd come here years before. The road felt longer than I remembered. The deeper I drove, the darker it seemed to get, even though it was early afternoon. The trees blocked the sky, and the quiet pressed in so thick it felt unnatural. I kept telling myself it was just unfamiliarity, just time making things seem different, but a slow, nervous sweat crept down my back. When the cabin finally came into view, I almost didn't recognize it. The small place had always been rough and simple, but now it looked like it had aged an entire decade in the 4 years since I'd last seen it. The wooden siding was darker, almost black in some places, like it had soaked in rain for months without drying. The roof sagged slightly at one corner. The front steps were warped, and part of the railing had snapped. The whole place looked tired and abandoned, as if someone had left in a hurry and never returned. I parked a short distance away, leaving the engine running for a moment while I scanned the tree line. No movement, no sign of anyone, but I felt watched, the same way you feel when walking down an empty street late at night, aware of shadows behind windows. Milo barked once, short, sharp, not aggressive, just uneasy. I stepped out. The air was colder than I expected, a silent kind of cold that sinks into your skin before you notice. I zipped my jacket and walked slowly toward the cabin. Milo stayed close to my leg, every muscle in his body stiff. His ears kept shifting toward the forest behind us. I told myself I only wanted to take a quick look, nothing more, maybe to prove to myself that the past was fully behind me. I climbed the steps, testing each one to make sure it wouldn't give out. The wood creaked under my weight, louder than seemed normal in the quiet of the woods. The front door was closed but not locked. When I pushed it gently, it swung inward with a low groan. Inside, the air was stale, even colder than outside, with a musty scent like damp clothes left in a basement too long. Dust coated every surface. The small kitchen looked untouched, except for the thin layer of dirt on the old counter. The living space was darker, the curtains half fallen from their rods. The furniture was in the same spots as before, but the cushions were sagging, and the fabric looked chewed in a few places, probably by rodents. But what bothered me wasn't the decay. It was the sense that something had been disturbed long after Aaron left. Small things, marks on the wooden floor near the far wall, a blanket that hadn't been there before, a faint trail of dried mud leading from the back door to the center of the room. My heartbeat quickened, steady but heavy, like footsteps inside my chest. I walked farther in. Milo refused to cross the threshold. He stayed at the doorway, eyes locked on the hallway that led to the bedroom. His tail was tucked low, and his breathing had changed. Quiet, controlled, nervous. I should have left, but the years of complicated emotions around this cabin, memories I didn't like but still carried, kept me moving. As I stepped into the hallway, the boards under my feet felt softer, almost spongy. Water damage. The smell grew stronger, not just damp anymore, but something metallic, something sharp and unpleasant. A chill crawled up my arms as I noticed the bedroom door was slightly open. I nudged it wider, expecting to find old clothes, dusty drawers, maybe a collapsed bed frame. But the bedroom looked lived in, or recently used. The bed was messy, sheets crumpled and tangled. Not old dust-covered sheets, freshly moved sheets. The floor had footprints in the thin layer of dust, and they weren't mine. They were larger, wider, some sharper at the edges like the boots were worn down. On the nightstand was a metal water bottle, not rusted or old, but scratched in a way that only happens from repeated daily use. My mouth went dry. Whoever had been staying here had been doing so recently. Very recently. I backed away slowly. My pulse hammered so hard I felt it in my fingertips. Milo began whining low from the doorway, shifting his weight from paw to paw. He kept glancing behind us, toward the woods, like he sensed something I couldn't see. The moment I stepped back into the living room, I noticed something I'd missed before. The back door, one I knew had been closed earlier, was now open a few inches. I froze. Milo barked again, louder, panicked this time, and that sound shook something loose inside me. I snapped out of my stillness and reached for him. As soon as I moved, heavy, slow footsteps sounded outside, on the wet ground behind the cabin. Not a deer, not an animal. Too heavy, too deliberate. Each step crunched the layer of fallen needles and soft mud in a slow and steady rhythm. Someone was walking around the cabin. I didn't breathe. I didn't think. Survival instinct drowned out every memory, every reason I came here. I grabbed Milo's collar and moved fast toward the front door. The air outside felt even colder now, darker, like the forest had tightened around the cabin. I heard the footsteps shift direction, speeding up, trying to approach the corner of the cabin nearest to where my car was parked. I sprinted to the car, Milo pulling ahead of me, finally breaking his fear into pure motion. I fumbled with the handle, yanked the door open, shoved him in, and then climbed in myself. My hands shook so badly I barely got the keys into the ignition. The engine roared to life. As I reversed, I saw a shape between the trees. A tall figure stepping back into the shadows, blurred by distance but unmistakably human. Broad shoulders, dark clothes, standing completely still, watching. I didn't look long. I sped down the dirt road, branches scraping the sides of the car, mud kicking up behind the tires. I didn't stop until I hit the main paved road, where I finally let myself breathe again, gasping like I'd been underwater. I never went back. I never told anyone what happened. I tried to forget the figure, the footprints, the open door. I tried to forget the feeling of being watched by someone who had been living in that cabin, unnoticed for who knows how long. But what sticks with me the most, even now, is one final detail. One that only hit me later that night. When I had looked around the bedroom, the footprints were deep, uneven, messy. But there had been a second set, two, smaller, lighter, placed carefully near the window. Two different people had been living there, and one of them had been standing close enough to the window to watch the road leading in. They must have seen my car the moment I arrived. That knowledge settled inside me in a way I still can't shake. Whoever they were, they weren't surprised by me. They were waiting. They watched me walk in, move through the cabin, walk into the bedroom. And when I finally realized something was wrong, they were already circling outside. I was lucky I got out when I did. and I will never go near that place again. I still think about that night on the farm, even though it has been years. Whenever I smell damp soil or hear the low hum of the wind against old wood, my mind goes back to that cabin and the cold, crawling feeling I had moving up my spine. Back then, in 2014, I was 29 and trying to get away from the noise of the city for a while. A friend told me about a farm in northern Nebraska where I could stay for cheap, far from the road, with nothing but wheat fields, cattle fences, and a thick line of trees that formed the border to a large stretch of private land. The cabin itself sat alone at the far end of the property. I had imagined it would be peaceful. In a way, it was, but it also made me aware of how exposed a person can feel when surrounded by open land and silence. The cabin was a small single-room thing with a metal roof and old boards that had dried and cracked from years of summer heat. On the outside, it looked like something forgotten, the kind of building people drive past without even noticing. Inside, the floor was uneven, and there was a faint smell of dust trapped in wood for too long. Still, it felt like a good place to breathe for a while. I unpacked my bag, placed everything on a small wooden table near the only window, and stepped outside to take in the view. The fields rolled out in every direction, golden and soft under the afternoon sun. In the distance, I heard a tractor, slow and steady, keeping its rhythm like a heartbeat. I stood there for a long time, enjoying the calm. That first night was uneventful. I cooked a simple meal on a small gas stove, listened to insects call from the grass, and read until the lantern dimmed. The air grew colder, and the metal roof creaked as it settled. I remember lying in bed, watching faint shadows shift across the ground as the wind moved the wheat outside. Everything felt harmless. I slept well. The next morning, I woke early, stepped outside, and walked along the fence line. The sun was barely up, and thin mist covered the fields. I noticed something odd near the edge of the property where the tall grass met the beginning of the trees. There was a trail, narrow and pressed down in a straight line leading into the woods. It didn't look like something made by cattle, and it didn't look fresh either. Maybe it had been there for a long time. I thought nothing of it at the time and kept walking. By the second night, the quiet felt different, less peaceful. When the sun set, the fields darkened quickly, swallowing the farmhouse lights miles away until everything outside the cabin turned into one wide black surface. I ate dinner, cleaned up, and tried to read again, but I kept glancing at the window. The darkness outside felt thicker than before, as if it was waiting. I brushed it off as my mind playing tricks. Isolation can make small things feel bigger than they are. I went to bed early that night. The roof groaned softly, and the wind moved through the wheat like a slow breath. I drifted to sleep, but not deeply. Sometime around midnight, I woke up suddenly, unsure why. The cabin was completely dark. The air felt cooler, heavier. There was a faint sound outside, very faint, almost like something brushing through the wheat. I stayed still, listening, trying to decide if it was an animal or the wind. It continued, soft and steady, like something moving with a purpose. The sound grew closer to the cabin, then stopped. The silence after that felt unnatural. I waited, thinking maybe it had been a deer or a stray dog, but then I heard a faint pressure shift on the wooden boards outside the front wall. Not a step exactly, more like weight being applied carefully. Slowly, I felt my heartbeat rise in my throat. I kept my breathing slow so I could hear better, and after maybe a minute, the sound came again. Another shift of weight, this time nearer to the door. The cabin wasn't built well. There were gaps in the boards where cold air slipped through, and I imagined the door frame bending slightly under someone or something leaning against it. My mind tried to force a rational explanation. It had to be an animal, maybe a large one, but the weight didn't move like that. It was too deliberate. I stayed awake for hours, listening to the wind, to the tiny clicks and cracks of the cabin cooling in the night. Eventually, I drifted off from exhaustion. In the morning, the first thing I did was check outside. The soil around the cabin was dry and packed down. I walked slowly along the walls, and when I reached the area near the door, I saw them, prints. Not boot prints, not shoes at all. They looked like bare footprints, wide and heavy, pressed deep enough in some spots that I could see the shape clearly. The toes, the arch, the heel, and they weren't small. Whoever had stood there had been much larger than me. I felt my stomach tighten as I looked around the fields. Everything was still. The sun was bright and warm. Nothing looked out of place. But those prints were undeniable. Someone had been there, moving around the cabin while I slept, and I had heard them. I tried to calm myself by thinking maybe they belonged to someone from the farm, but the thought didn't help. There was no reason for anyone to walk barefoot across thorny, uneven ground in the middle of the night, and the trail I had seen the previous morning, suddenly it felt connected. The day passed slowly. I tried distracting myself, walking farther along the fence line and exploring the property more than before. But everywhere I went, I felt like I was being watched, like the wide open fields weren't empty after all. By the time the sun began to set, dread had already settled into my chest. That night was worse. I tried to stay awake, but after hours of forcing my eyes open, I eventually drifted off. When I woke again, it was to the same soft brushing sound moving through the wheat outside. I felt cold instantly. The brushing moved in a slow arc around the cabin, steady, as if whoever or whatever was circling it. The steps came next, barely audible but unmistakable. Soft, cautious, and close. My breathing turned shallow. I didn't dare move. The steps came to the door again. Then a long silence. I imagined someone standing there, leaning forward, listening to me inside. I could feel the quiet press against my ears like pressure. After what felt like an hour, something touched the window. Faint scrape, just once, but enough to send a jolt through my whole body. I stayed frozen under the blanket, not even blinking. Eventually, the sounds faded. The brushing through the wheat grew distant, and then nothing. I didn't sleep again. I waited until the first light appeared, grabbed my bag, and stepped outside. The prints were back, more of them this time, circling the cabin like a slow dance. They were deep and spaced unevenly, as if the person walked with an odd rhythm, almost dragging their feet. My decision to leave wasn't dramatic or rushed. It was simple. I knew staying one more night would break me. I kept checking the field edges as I walked toward the gravel road where the farm's old pickup waited. The air was cold, and the sky was clear. Everything looked normal, untouched, but I couldn't shake the feeling of something watching from the tall grass, hidden just below the tips of the wheat. On the drive back to town, I kept glancing into the rearview mirror, expecting to see someone standing in the road, but there was nothing behind me except dust. Later that afternoon, when I returned the key to the farm owner, he asked how the stay was. I didn't tell him anything. There was nothing he could do about it, and saying it out loud felt like giving the fear more weight. I never went back. I never looked up who owned the land beyond the tree line or who might have been moving through the wheat at night. I don't think I want to know. Every few months I dream about the cabin. The cold boards, the dark window, the slow movement outside, and I wake with the same tightness in my chest I felt back then. The clear truth is this: whoever was out there was real. Not a story, not my imagination, not anything supernatural. They were human, and they were close enough to breathe against the thin walls of that old cabin while I lay inside pretending to be asleep. That is the part that stays with me the most. Not what I heard, but what I didn't see. I never wanted to spend that week alone in the mountains of northern Colorado, but I had promised myself I would take a long break after years of working nonstop. It was the fall of 2019, and the early cold had already pushed into the higher parts of the range. I was 31 then, tired, and trying to convince myself that a remote cabin was the peace I needed. I rented a small wooden place near a thin dirt road that twisted through dead pine trees still standing from an old wildfire 10 years earlier. The owner lived 3 hours away. He left the keys under a rock near the door and told me the place would be completely quiet. I reached the cabin near sunset. The last stretch of the drive had been nothing but dark trunks, broken tree limbs, and dirty snow frozen in patches. The cold air felt heavy. The cabin was smaller than the photos showed, with wood darkened by age and a metal roof covered in pine needles. There was a water tank behind it, a tiny shed, and a narrow porch with a railing that leaned outward. A field stretched out in front of it with tall yellow grass that moved like slow waves. Beyond that, the treeline closed in again. Inside, everything smelled like dust and old ash. A small wood stove sat in the corner, blackened and rusty. The kitchen counter was uneven, and the floor creaked everywhere I walked. There was no phone service, no internet, not even a radio signal. Just the stillness of the mountains pressing down on the cabin. The first night went calmly. I unpacked, lit the stove, and listened to the wind scraping across the roof. The isolation made me uneasy, but I kept telling myself that was the point. I ate canned soup, watched the flames inside the stove, and fell asleep early. The second night was when things changed. I had spent the whole day walking a trail behind the cabin that led deeper into the burned forest. The trees looked like giant black bones sticking up from the ground. I found tracks in the mud near a frozen creek. Large ones, maybe from an elk or a big dog. Some were fresh. I took a few photos and kept moving, but the woods felt strangely silent. Even birds avoided that area. When I returned to the cabin later that afternoon, I noticed something odd near the porch. The soil looked disturbed, like someone had stepped there recently, but the shape didn't match boots. They were wider, almost like bare human prints, but the toes were spread too far apart. I tried to ignore it. Maybe the rain had warped them. Maybe an animal had stepped on soft ground. I forced myself not to overthink. That night, the air temperature dropped sharply. Thin frost formed on the windows. I woke up around 2 a.m. because something was moving in the field outside. The grass rustled in a slow wave, like something walking carefully. I stayed still in bed and listened. There was a low, dragging sound, like a foot pulling through thick grass. No clear steps, just slow movement stopping every few seconds. I held my breath for minutes. The sound finally faded away toward the tree line, so I told myself it was a deer. I slept poorly after that. The next morning, the field had 2 long trails of flattened grass running through it. They looked like dragging lines leading from the far edge toward the cabin, stopping about 20 feet from the porch. I felt a cold twist in my stomach. Deer didn't move like that. I walked out a bit but didn't go far. The cold wind made the grass hiss around my legs. I didn't see anything else. I spent the day inside, reading through an old magazine the owner left. The cabin walls seemed thinner that day. Every sound outside felt louder, sharper, like the world was trying to push inside. When darkness came again, I tried to sleep early, but my nerves kept me awake. Around 11 p.m., I heard a low whining sound outside the cabin. It wasn't an animal cry I recognized. It sounded almost like a person trying to hold back pain. The sound drifted across the field, stopped, then started again closer. I froze in bed. My heart thumped so loud I felt it in my hands. The whining came again, but this time it sounded like it was right under the window. I lay still for almost an hour. Eventually the sound moved away, soft and irregular, until it faded completely. When morning came, I finally gathered the courage to step outside. Frost covered everything, and the grass near the cabin had been pressed down in a circular pattern, as if someone had crouched there for a long time. I found what looked like a handprint in the frost, 5 long finger marks reaching across the wood of the porch. The fingers were too long to be normal. For the rest of the day, I stayed inside with the stove burning nonstop. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching the cabin from the woods. Every movement of the trees made me flinch. I barely ate anything. When night came again, I stayed awake in bed, listening. At some point, maybe around 1 a.m., I heard footsteps on the porch. Slow, uneven, scraping footsteps. Something heavy shifted its weight above the wooden boards. I stared at the ceiling, gripping the blankets, afraid to breathe. The footsteps moved until they were right in front of the door. Then they stopped. The cabin felt like it was holding its breath with me. For a long time, nothing happened. Then something brushed against the door. Not a knock, more like fingers tracing the wood. I imagined long, cold hands feeling around the edges of the doorframe, searching for a weakness. The scraping stopped. Silence filled the room. Suddenly, a soft thump hit the wall near my bedroom window. Another one followed, closer. I stayed frozen until sunrise. When morning finally came, I found muddy smears on the porch railing and strange marks pressed into the frost along the cabin wall. They looked like footprints, but each had a different shape, like someone had tried to change how they stepped. Some looked almost human. Others were twisted sideways like an animal's. I knew then that whatever was out there wasn't some wild creature. It was someone moving through the woods who knew how to imitate animals, how to crawl, how to drag themselves through grass to stay low. Someone who watched cabins like mine. Someone who came close at night to test doors and windows, learning routines, learning sounds. I packed my things without eating breakfast. The morning felt thick and gray, like the sky wanted to collapse on top of the field. As I loaded my bag into the car, I heard movement in the tree line. A faint rustle. A figure shifted between the black trunks, low to the ground, watching. I couldn't see details, only the shape, bent, thin, too still for an animal. I didn't wait. I got in the car, locked the doors, and drove down the dirt road as fast as I could. The road twisted violently, and the burned forest seemed to lean over me as I passed. The farther I got, the more I felt a strange mix of relief and dread, like whatever had been watching me was letting me go because it had lost interest, not because I had escaped. When I reached the main highway, I finally felt my body loosen. My hands were shaking so badly I had to pull over for a minute. The silence of the mountains felt heavier than ever, like the whole place hid things people weren't meant to see. I told the cabin owner I was leaving early and dropped the keys at a gas station like he asked. I never explained why. I didn't have the words. All I knew was that something lived in those burned woods. Something human enough to frighten in ways animals couldn't. Someone who moved in the dark with strange steps and long fingers. Someone who watched and waited and studied anyone who stayed alone out there. People call those things skinwalkers because it's easier than admitting there are men out there who are willing to crawl on all fours, drag themselves through frozen grass, and change their bodies through pure practice and obsession until they don't look or move like people anymore. But they are human, just the kind that live in the places the rest of us avoid. I have never gone back to any remote cabin since. Even cities feel too quiet at night sometimes, because when the wind moves in a certain way, I remember those dragging steps in the grass and the long fingers against the door. And I know that what I saw was real, because the fear never washed away. It stayed with me, clear and sharp, like frost on old wood. And I know one thing. Whatever watched me from that field had gotten close enough to learn my breathing, my steps, and the way I slept. If I had stayed one more night, I don't think I would have driven away at all. It was the autumn of 2016 when I decided to take a short break from my monotonous life in London. The city had started to feel suffocating. Gray skies, endless noise, and people who never looked at you, never acknowledged you beyond a polite nod or the brushing past in the tube. I needed silence, and more than anything, I needed a place where I could feel completely alone for a while. That's how I ended up booking a small cabin in the Scottish Highlands, somewhere near Loch Ness but far enough from the tourist traps that it promised quiet and solitude. The cabin itself was exactly as described in the listing. A small, stone-built structure with ivy crawling halfway up its walls, a steeply pitched roof, and a single chimney that must have seen better days. The road leading to it was narrow, flanked by dense forests that seemed to swallow the fading light as I drove along. The moment I parked the car in the small gravel patch by the cabin, I felt an odd stillness. Not the pleasant kind you hope for, but the kind that sits heavy on your chest, as if the air itself is watching you. I was a 32-year-old freelance photographer at the time, which meant I usually spent long stretches in empty or abandoned places anyway. Yet, there was something about this cabin that felt off. Nothing specific, really. No strange marks, no signs of forced entry, just a sense that I wasn't entirely alone. I shrugged it off, blaming it on exhaustion from the drive. I unloaded my bags, lit the old iron fireplace, and let the fire crackle as I settled into the worn armchair that faced the loch visible through the cabin's only large window. The first night passed uneventfully, if you ignored the occasional strange sound outside. Twigs snapping, leaves brushing against the walls, a distant, low hum I couldn't identify. I told myself it was wildlife or the wind, but as I lay in bed staring at the wooden ceiling, I realized I hadn't heard any birds chirping that day, no rustle of deer in the nearby fields, nothing, just silence. The following morning, I decided to take a walk through the forest that bordered the cabin. The air was damp, the smell of wet leaves thick and earthy. I followed a narrow path, my boots sinking slightly into the soft ground. After about an hour, I stumbled across a small clearing where the mist hung low, clinging to the roots of trees and patches of moss. That's when I saw her for the first time. She was standing near the edge of the clearing, half hidden by the fog. At first, I thought she was a local, a woman walking her dog or gathering firewood. But as I got closer, I noticed the way she didn't move naturally. She just stood there, her head tilted slightly, staring in my direction. She was tall, thin, her long dark hair falling in wet strands around her face, which was pale in a way that seemed almost unnatural. Her clothing was old-fashioned, a long woolen coat that hung from her frame like it was decades out of date, and her boots were caked in mud. I stopped walking, unsure if I should call out. Something about her made me uneasy. The way her eyes didn't blink and the way her mouth was set in a thin, hard line. Before I could think too much about it, she turned and disappeared into the fog. No sound, no movement in the trees, nothing but the faint scent of damp earth left behind. My chest tightened, but I told myself it was just the mist playing tricks on my eyes. Perhaps someone else was staying in a cabin further down the trail, I thought. I shook my head and walked back to mine, brushing it off. The next day, as I unpacked my camera gear, I noticed something odd. On the small porch outside my cabin, there were footprints in the mud leading up to the door. They were large, irregular, and old, as if someone had stepped in yesterday's rain and had taken care not to leave a trace behind. I froze, staring at them. There was no one around, no sign of a neighbor, no other cabins visible in the distance. My stomach twisted. The idea of someone approaching my cabin without my knowledge made my heart pound. I checked the locks, even though the cabin's door had only a simple latch. I bolted it with a heavy piece of wood I found inside, but sleep did not come easily that night. Every creak of the cabin, every snap of a branch outside, made me jump. By the third day, my nerves were fraying. I decided to go further into the forest, hoping that keeping myself busy would distract me. I walked for hours, deeper than I had the first day, until I found a small river cutting through the trees. The water was icy cold, and I knelt to dip my hands in it, just to ground myself, when movement in the corner of my eye made me spin around. She was there again, standing across the river, only 20 or so feet away. Her coat was soaked, hair plastered to her face, and this time, she wasn't moving at all. She just stood, staring, as if she had been waiting for me. My camera, hanging around my neck, felt suddenly heavy. I raised it without thinking, but when I tried to focus, she was gone. No splash in the water, no movement, nothing. Just the mist rolling over the riverbank. Fear settled into my bones. I ran back to the cabin, every step making me more anxious, heart hammering, lungs burning. That night, I barely slept, and I started keeping a large kitchen knife next to my bed. On the fourth day, I woke to a sound that froze me instantly. Someone or something was moving around the outside of the cabin. Slow, deliberate steps circling the structure. I stayed in bed, holding my breath, listening. The footsteps stopped, then started again, this time closer to the window. I peeked through the curtains and saw nothing. The mist had rolled in thick, hiding everything beyond 5 feet. But I knew she was there. I could feel her. By now, I had a plan. I wasn't going to wait for her to make a move. I packed my things hastily and prepared to leave, knowing the gravel path would give me a clear shot to the main road. I stepped outside just as the first pale light of dawn touched the treetops. The mist hung thick, but it was light enough to see the path ahead. That's when I saw her one final time. She emerged from the forest, walking slowly toward the cabin. Her expression was unreadable, but something in the way she moved, deliberate, calm, but inexorably forward, made my stomach sink. My mind raced. I ran. I didn't look back. My boots pounded against the gravel, my chest heaving, adrenaline surging. I didn't stop until the trees thinned and the road appeared, a narrow ribbon leading back toward civilization. I made it to the nearest village hours later, shaking, muddy, exhausted. I explained as best as I could to the innkeeper where I had been, the cabin, the woman. She nodded politely, as if she had heard similar stories before, and said nothing of the kind. I didn't care. I booked the first bus back to Edinburgh and didn't stop until I was back in the city. Among the noise, the lights, and the crowds, the safety of strangers, the mundane movement of people, felt comforting in a way that the Scottish wilderness never could. Weeks later, I discovered in a local news archive that the area around the cabin had been notorious for people going missing in the woods. There were reports of a woman, described vaguely as tall and thin, with long dark hair, spotted near several disappearances. Authorities never caught her, never explained it. I never returned to the Highlands. I never wanted to, but sometimes, late at night, when the wind rattles my apartment windows, I swear I can see her standing just beyond the mist, watching, waiting, patient as ever. And that thought, that persistent certainty, reminds me every day that the world is bigger and stranger than I ever allow myself to believe. I drove north out of Maine in the late autumn of 1998, when the days were short and the air felt like it carried tiny needles in it. I was 32 at the time, and I remember how the cold settled into my bones more easily than it used to. I had taken a week off work, thinking a quiet break in the woods might help clear my head after months of stress. I chose a remote area near the edge of Baxter State Park, far from the main trails and far from the spots where tourists usually stopped. I had no plan except to hike during the day and sleep in my car or set up a small tent if the weather allowed. The first 3 days were peaceful. I spent hours walking through the heavy pines and the thick carpets of fallen needles that softened every step. The ground smelled like sap and wet soil, and the air was always still. Some parts of the trails looked like no one had walked them in years. That was what I wanted: silence, space, and the feeling of being far away from anyone who knew me. On the fourth day, clouds rolled in early, dark and heavy, and I decided to take a new path I hadn't noticed before. It was narrow and partly blocked by branches, almost hidden, but it looked like it had been used long ago. I followed it out of curiosity more than anything else. The light dimmed fast as the clouds thickened, and the wind picked up, brushing against the back of my neck every so often. The trail twisted deeper into the woods, and the trees grew closer together, almost forming walls on both sides. After about an hour, I saw a shape in the distance through the trees. At first, I thought it was some large boulder or fallen shed, but as I got closer, the shape sharpened into a cabin. It sat alone in a natural dip in the ground, hidden from anyone who didn't know to look for it. The wood was faded to a dull gray, and parts of the siding had peeled away completely. The roof sagged in the middle. Long grass and weeds pushed up around the steps and wrapped around the porch posts. It looked like it had been left there to rot for decades. Something about the cabin made my stomach feel tight. It wasn't fear at first, just the heavy silence around it. No birds, no rustling, no sound except the wind brushing across the roof. I should have turned back then, but the weather looked like it might turn into a storm, and I didn't want to be caught miles from my car with the light dropping fast. The cabin looked like it might give a bit of shelter while I waited out the worst of it, at least long enough for the wind to settle. I stepped onto the porch, and the boards beneath my boots flexed with a soft groan. The smell coming from inside was faint but noticeable. Stale wood, dust, and something else that I couldn't place at first. When I pushed the door, it swung open with almost no resistance, as though someone had oiled the hinges recently, which didn't match the look of everything else. Inside, the air felt colder than the air outside. The room was small, maybe 15 feet across, with an old iron stove in the corner and a wooden table with 2 legs missing. A narrow bed frame leaned against one wall, the mattress long gone. Dirt covered the floor in uneven patches. In the far corner, scattered across the boards, were old cans, torn cloth, and what looked like the remains of a backpack that mice had chewed through. I walked in slowly, scanning the details. I noticed scratches on the inside walls, not carved in any pattern, just long, chaotic lines, like someone had scraped metal along them. The smell I couldn't place earlier grew stronger near the back wall. It was sour, like old sweat mixed with damp clothes that had never dried. Not mold, not rot, something more human. I told myself the place had probably been used by hunters or drifters over the years. Old sweat could cling to wood for a long time. That explanation kept me calm enough to stay inside as the wind howled outside and the air darkened even more. A thick gust shook the cabin hard enough to rattle the loose boards on the roof. I stood near the center of the room, arms crossed to keep warm, and tried to convince myself I only needed to wait an hour, maybe 2. The storm would pass. But after a few minutes, I heard something from behind the cabin, soft, slow, and deliberate. It sounded like a footstep, but not heavy, more like weight settling on dry leaves. Then another step, then stillness. The cabin had no windows on the back wall, and the side windows were so dirty I could barely see through them. I felt my heart thumping in my chest, steady but fast. The woods were full of animals, I told myself. A deer or even a black bear might pass close without caring that the cabin was there. Another step. This one was closer, right behind the wall where the mattress frame leaned. I didn't move, didn't breathe deeply, didn't even shift my weight. The smell in the room changed again. Stronger, fresher, like someone who had been running and sweating was suddenly nearby. The back of my neck prickled. That smell wasn't from decades ago. It was recent. I stepped quietly toward the doorway, ready to leave whether the storm was over or not. The wind hit the cabin again, loud enough to mask small sounds, but I heard something inside now. Faint shift, like someone pressing down on a loose board. I scanned the room one last time, and that was when I noticed something I had missed before. On the floor near the far wall, half covered by dirt, were footprints. Not old ones, fresh ones. They led toward the corner where the broken backpack lay, as if someone had been crouching there recently. I moved toward the door, keeping my steps slow so the boards wouldn't creak too much. My breathing felt too loud in my ears. The smell was now thick behind me, as though someone had stepped into the room without walking through the door. When I reached the porch, I didn't look back. I stepped down onto the ground, and that was when I saw them. Prints in the soft earth, circling the cabin. They were spaced unevenly, as though whoever made them had been walking slowly, stopping often. And they were recent, maybe minutes old. The wind whipped at my jacket as I started back down the trail. I didn't run at first, too afraid that running would make noise and noise would draw attention. I kept my steps quick but controlled, listening hard for anything behind me. After maybe 5 minutes, I heard it again. A branch snapping, not loud but clear. Then another, like someone was following at a steady pace, just behind the tree line. I didn't see anyone when I glanced to the side, but the sound stayed with me, matching my speed. That was when something inside me broke. I started running, pushing myself harder than I had in years. My breath burned in my throat and my legs felt heavy, but I didn't stop. The trail twisted and narrowed, and more than once I slipped on loose leaves, but fear kept me upright. The snapping branches grew softer eventually, fading until I heard nothing but my own breath and the wind. When I finally reached my car, I threw myself inside, locked the doors, and sat there shaking. I didn't start the engine right away. I listened. I looked at every tree. I waited for movement. Nothing came. I drove away as fast as I could, not caring about the potholes or the way the road jerked the car from side to side. When I got back to town, I parked near a small gas station and stayed there for almost an hour before I felt steady enough to move again. I didn't report it. I wouldn't have known what to say. I never went back to that area, and I stopped hiking alone after that. Even now, years later, what stays with me the most isn't the cabin or the smell or the fresh footprints inside. It's the simple, quiet steps behind the wall. Steps that came after I was already inside. Steps that didn't match mine. Steps that told me, without a single word spoken, that the cabin hadn't been abandoned at all, and whoever was staying there had been much, much closer than I realized. I remember the summer of 1998 vividly. I was 26 at the time, working my first real season as a park ranger in the dense wilderness of northern Montana, around the Bitterroot National Forest. I had taken the job thinking it would be peaceful, a chance to get away from the city, to breathe in pine-scented air and spend my nights under the stars. I got assigned to a small, isolated ranger cabin tucked deep in a hollow near the confluence of two small rivers, miles from the nearest ranger station. The cabin was old, built in the 1940s, with a sagging roof and a stone chimney that had long since developed a slow leak, leaving dark streaks across the weathered wood. The floors creaked under every step, and the windows rattled whenever a gust of wind blew down the valley. The first week was uneventful. My days were filled with routine patrols, checking on backcountry trails, logging wildlife sightings, and keeping track of any unauthorized campers. I would wake early, around 5, and walk along the river trail, the ground damp with morning dew. The air was sharp, clean, and smelled faintly of moss and decaying leaves. Birds were everywhere, their calls echoing off the hills, and I would often see deer grazing in the clearing near the cabin. Nights were different, though. Without electricity, I relied on a small gas lamp for light and the occasional battery-powered lantern. The darkness outside was total, pressing, and cold. The wind through the trees sounded like distant footsteps, and the river's murmur seemed louder than it had any right to be. About 2 weeks in, I noticed odd signs near the cabin. I would come back from patrols and see footprints that weren't mine. They were heavy, booted tracks, sometimes heading toward the river, sometimes stopping near the tree line. I first tried to rationalize them. Maybe hikers, maybe hunters, but the closest trailhead was nearly 6 miles away, and I hadn't seen anyone on the patrols. My radio was nearly useless out there. Reception was spotty at best, and at night, the static in the speaker made the little cabin feel even more isolated. One afternoon, while checking a steep ridge trail above the river, I spotted a small campsite tucked between 2 fallen pine trees. It looked recent. Ashes in the fire pit were still dark and warm, and a few empty food wrappers were scattered around. I didn't see anyone nearby, but my gut twisted. Hunters sometimes set up illegally, but most knew better than to camp this far off the trail. I made a note in my log and headed back to the cabin, the hairs on the back of my neck prickling. That night, around 11, the first real sign that something was off hit me. I was sitting at the small wooden table in the cabin, writing in my logbook by gas lamp, when I heard it, a faint tapping at the window. My first thought was a branch, but when I leaned over to look, nothing moved outside. The tapping stopped, then started again, slower, deliberate. My stomach dropped. I grabbed the flashlight from the shelf and shone it toward the window. Nothing. The river's sound was steady, but now there was another noise. The crunch of leaves, the snap of twigs, slow steps circling the cabin. I froze. I checked my small lock on the door. It was old and nearly rusted through, but at least it would buy me a few minutes if anyone tried to force it. I kept the flashlight in my hand and stayed low, crouched by the table. The steps didn't run, didn't shout, didn't call. They just moved around the cabin's perimeter, methodical, almost human, but not quite. After what felt like an hour, they stopped. The silence returned, heavier than the night before. I didn't sleep that night, sitting upright in the corner with the flashlight across my lap, scanning the shadows. The next morning, I found the footprints again, larger than any of my boots, circling the cabin. They were mud-stained, deep, and unmistakably deliberate. Whoever or whatever had made them hadn't come in, but it was clear they had been watching. I made a mental note to check the surrounding area with extra care during my patrol. Over the next few days, the feeling of being watched never left me. I began leaving small traps of flour in the dirt near the cabin's entrances, just to see if anyone approached when I wasn't looking. Each morning, the flour was disturbed, and the prints returned, though I never saw anyone in daylight. The radio would sometimes pick up faint, distorted voices or static bursts, even when I was careful to stay tuned to the local ranger frequency. One night, a storm rolled in from the west. Rain pounded the roof, wind howled through the hollow, and lightning lit the sky in blinding flashes. The cabin groaned with every gust, and I was tucked into the corner, listening to the storm, trying to ignore the sense of dread building in my chest. Then I heard the unmistakable sound of a branch breaking near the back of the cabin. My flashlight barely illuminated the edge of the woods, but I could see movement. A tall figure, hunched, moving slowly through the trees. Not running, just watching. I knew I had to act. I grabbed the only weapon I had, a small hunting rifle kept for emergency wildlife encounters, and slipped into the rain-soaked night. Mud squished under my boots as I circled the cabin, keeping the figure in sight. But the second I tried to approach, it vanished, melting into the woods like it had never been there. I searched for hours, following footprints in the mud that seemed to appear and disappear at random. By dawn, soaked, exhausted, and terrified, I returned to the cabin. I considered calling it in, but the storm had knocked out any chance of reaching the ranger station. For the next week, I stayed hyper-aware. I kept the rifle close, reinforced the door with a heavy log, and even hung a few tripwires near the periphery of the cabin. Eventually, the figures stopped appearing, and the prints disappeared as mysteriously as they had come. I never did figure out who or what it was. Maybe hunters, maybe someone else, but the fear lingered. I realized that in places like that, isolation magnifies even the smallest threats. Every shadow became a shape, every noise a signal. By the end of the summer, I was exhausted mentally and physically. The cabin, which had once seemed peaceful, now felt oppressive. But I had grown stronger, more alert, and more aware of the fine line between safety and danger in the wild. When I finally packed up and drove back to the ranger station, I took one last look at the hollow and the river beyond. The place was as beautiful as ever, but I knew I'd never take solitude for granted again. Looking back now, more than 25 years later, that cabin remains etched in my memory. Not because of anything supernatural, but because of how raw and real fear can feel when you are completely alone in the wilderness. I never encountered the figure again, and no one else reported anything unusual in that hollow. Life went on. I learned to trust my instincts, to respect the forest, and to understand that sometimes the scariest things are not monsters, but the unknown, and the knowledge that someone else could be out there watching when you thought you were completely alone. Even now, whenever I hike deep into the wilderness, I remember that summer. I remember the rain pounding against the roof, the sound of footsteps circling in the dark, and the hollow silence of a forest that is beautiful, dangerous, and full of secrets. That cabin, with its creaking floors and rattling windows, taught me that fear isn't about ghosts or fairy tales. It's about awareness, survival, and the thin, fragile line between solitude and danger. I didn't plan to spend the night in that cabin. It happened in late October of 2019, somewhere deep in the northern woods of Minnesota, miles from the nearest paved road. I was 33 then, old enough to understand danger, but still careless enough to think nothing bad would ever actually happen to me. I had gone out there for a quiet weekend, planning to hike, fish, and sit by the fire while the cold air rolled through the trees. I had rented a small hunting cabin that looked old in the pictures, but seemed good enough for one person who didn't mind rough conditions. When I reached it, the place looked worse than I expected. The cabin leaned slightly to the right, like the ground had shifted under it over the years. The wooden boards were gray and dry, and the metal roof had rust spreading across it like old blood stains. Even the steps creaked under my boots as if they were tired of being stepped on. Still, I wasn't picky. I just wanted a quiet, slow weekend where the rest of the world felt far away. The air smelled like pine and cold dirt. The wind made a dull hum as it moved through the tall trees that surrounded the clearing. The forest seemed too thick, the kind of woods where sunlight struggled to reach the ground. That should have made me uneasy, but it didn't then. I had been looking forward to the silence. The cabin interior was small. One room with a bed, a rough wooden table, a small stove, and a single window facing the trees behind the cabin. Dust covered everything. Old hunting magazines lay stacked in a corner, and a broken lantern sat beside them. A thin mattress on the bed sagged toward the middle, and the whole place smelled like old wood that had soaked up years of cold nights and damp seasons. I unpacked my bag, placed my food in the cooler, and set up my sleeping bag on the bed to make it more comfortable. I walked around the area for a while, checking the tree line, the fire pit, and the small trail that led down toward a shallow creek. It was quiet enough that every small sound felt louder than it should. A snapping twig, a falling pine cone, even the rustle of branches made the place feel alive in a way that didn't match the still air. By late afternoon, the temperature dropped fast. I gathered firewood before it got dark and stacked it near the cabin door. When the sun went down, the forest around me turned black in minutes. I had seen dark woods before, but this felt different. The trees were packed so tightly that the night looked like a solid wall of blackness. My flashlight beam seemed weak and thin, like it couldn't push far enough into the dark to make a difference. Inside the cabin, I lit the small battery lantern I brought with me. Its soft white light made the shadows stretch across the walls, long and thin. The cabin made noises every few minutes, small cracks and pops as the cold settled into the old wood. At first, I ignored them, thinking they were normal for such an old place. But the sounds grew more irregular as the night got later. Sharp taps, quick thuds, not consistent, not repeating. Around 10, I heard something outside. A slow dragging sound near the back of the cabin. It wasn't wind. It wasn't an animal running. It sounded like something heavy brushing across the fallen leaves and hitting small branches as it moved. I froze, sitting on the edge of the bed, listening with every muscle tight. The dragging stopped, then I heard soft steps, too light to be a deer but too heavy to be a raccoon. I sat there holding my breath. The light from the lantern felt too bright, like it would draw attention to me. The only window in the cabin was behind me, facing the woods where the noise came from. I didn't want to turn around, not yet. I just listened, waiting for more sound. Came a few seconds later. A slow scrape across the outer wall of the cabin. Something brushing the wood. Something close enough that I felt the vibration through the floorboards. My skin prickled as I finally turned toward the window. All I could see was darkness. But there, in that darkness, something moved just enough to break the shape of the black tree line. Faint outline. A pale shape lower than a person but higher than any normal animal around here. It stayed still, almost like it was watching, even though I couldn't make out any features. I didn't breathe for several seconds. My heartbeat felt loud in my ears. I reached for my flashlight slowly and aimed it at the window. The beam hit the glass and bounced back at me because of the reflection, but as I shifted it slightly, the light caught something outside. A figure, not tall, not standing straight, but hunched in a way that made its shoulders look uneven. I couldn't see a face, just the shape of a head turned toward the cabin, and what looked like one arm hanging too long, almost touching the ground. My hand started shaking so much that the flashlight beam wobbled over the window frame. The figure moved slightly, enough to show that it wasn't frozen or stuck. It was alive, watching me from only a few feet away. I backed away from the window, my legs trembling so hard I almost fell. I turned off the lantern and stood in the dark cabin, trying to calm myself. Without the light, the inside of the cabin was pitch black. I pressed myself against the opposite wall, gripping the flashlight like a weapon even though it was useless. For several minutes, nothing happened. No scrapping, no steps, no dragging. The silence grew heavy. I could feel the cold air seeping through the gaps in the wooden walls. Then the footsteps started again, slow and soft, circling the cabin. They stopped at the front door. I could hear breathing, quiet but real, right outside, separated from me by a thin, old wooden door. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to run, but running into a forest that dark felt worse. I stayed perfectly still, barely able to keep myself upright. After what felt like an hour but was probably only 10 minutes, the footsteps moved away. They circled once more, then faded into the woods. The trees swallowed the sound until there was nothing left but the cold and the beating of my heart. I didn't sleep at all. I stayed awake on the bed, gripping my flashlight, waiting for the noise to return. Didn't. The cabin stayed quiet until dawn. When the first gray light came through the window, I finally moved. My legs were stiff and weak. I packed my bag fast, barely caring if I folded anything. I stepped outside expecting to find footprints, marks, something that explained what I saw. There were tracks in the leaves, but they didn't look like anything I recognized. Large stepped areas, long dragged spots, and places where the leaves were pushed aside as if something crawled or pulled itself forward. Whatever had been out there moved strangely, unevenly, like it didn't belong in the woods but forced itself through them anyway. I didn't stay long enough to study the tracks. I walked straight to my car, started the engine with shaking hands, and drove down the dirt road without looking back at the cabin. The moment the tree line opened and the sky widened, I felt my chest loosen. I reached the main road an hour later. Only then did I let myself breathe normally again. To this day, I don't know what I saw. I don't try to explain it. I don't tell anyone the full story because I know how it sounds, and I know people love to twist things into something supernatural. But there was nothing magical or impossible about what I saw. It was real. It was something alive. Something that moved through the woods with purpose and understanding. I haven't gone back to a cabin alone since. I haven't camped in deep woods. I haven't walked into any place where the trees are so thick that the dark feels solid. That night taught me something I never forgot. The world still has things in it that we don't understand, things that stay out of sight until we accidentally step into their territory. And when we do, they watch us the way I watch them, quiet, tense, waiting to see what happens next. It was the fall of 1998, and I had decided to escape the suffocating routine of city life for a week. I was 32, tired of deadlines and the constant hum of traffic. My plan was simple: rent a small hunting cabin somewhere deep in northern Minnesota, far from cell towers, far from the noise, and spend my days in the woods, hunting, hiking, and reading by the fire. I packed my old hunting gear, my dog Rusty, and a few essentials into the truck and drove north. The air became sharper as I left the towns behind, the roads narrowing into gravel and then dirt. Trees pressed close on either side, their leaves a riot of orange, red, and brown, and a chill ran through the cab even with the heat on full blast. I arrived late in the afternoon. The cabin was smaller than I imagined, tucked just beyond a bend in a dense pine grove, its cedar walls weathered and gray, and the roof sagging slightly in the center. The porch creaked under my boots, and the door opened with a groan. Inside, it smelled of old wood and faint smoke, and a single kerosene lamp sat on the small table in the corner. Rusty padded around, sniffing every corner, ears perked, tail wagging cautiously. The cabin was basic. One small room with a wood-burning stove, a couple of bunks, a tiny kitchen corner, and a scattering of rusty hunting gear left behind by previous occupants. The windows were dusty, and the forest beyond seemed unusually dark and thick, even for late afternoon. I spent the first evening unpacking, checking my guns, and making a fire. Rusty lay by the stove, his body heat warming the corner where I stacked firewood. As night fell, the forest outside became an oppressive black, and every small sound seemed amplified. The snap of a branch, the rustle of leaves, the distant cry of some animal. It was exhilarating and terrifying at the same time. I felt a primal sense of being watched, though I told myself it was just nerves, the forest settling into its nocturnal rhythm. The first night, sleep was fitful. Every creak of the cabin floor made me start. Every gust of wind rattled the window frames. Around 3 in the morning, Rusty growled low in his throat. I sat up, listening. Outside, a branch snapped, not far away. I told myself it was a deer, maybe a raccoon, but my heart raced. I had hunted these woods before, and I knew the sound of other humans was unmistakable. But I saw nothing. Eventually, exhaustion overcame fear, and I dozed off with the stove ticking and Rusty at my feet. The next day, I ventured into the woods with my rifle and Rusty. The forest was dense, and the trail was barely visible. I spotted deer tracks in the mud and followed them cautiously. The light filtering through the canopy gave the woods an almost greenish glow. Rusty moved ahead, sniffing everything, alert for sounds I couldn't hear. Hours passed, and I realized I had walked further than I planned. I checked the sun and started back, but the forest seemed to have shifted. Trees looked unfamiliar, trails seemed to vanish. That evening, I returned to the cabin exhausted, but something felt off. On the porch, a small pile of broken branches lay as if someone had stepped there. I had not left the path clear when I came back. Rusty sniffed it cautiously, ears flat, tail stiff. The nights grew worse. Each one, I could hear movements outside, almost deliberate. Branches snapping, footsteps crunching on leaves, always just outside the window. I never saw anyone, but the sensation of being watched became unbearable. I double-checked my locks, my guns, the cabin walls, trying to rationalize it. The woods were alive. Sounds carried differently at night, but still, the pattern unnerved me. Someone or something was circling the cabin, waiting, studying. One morning, I woke to find something I couldn't explain. The front door, which I had locked, was slightly ajar. There were no footprints leading to or from it, no signs of forced entry. Rusty growled at the opening, hackles raised. I inspected the cabin thoroughly. Nothing missing, nothing damaged, but my stomach churned with unease. I felt violated, as if my sanctuary had been intruded upon while I slept. That day, I decided I wouldn't go far from the cabin anymore. Hunting would wait. Survival came first. I set up a perimeter with noise traps, tin cans on strings, tripwires, anything to alert me to approach. That night, I heard the first proper sound of someone moving deliberately around the cabin. The clinking of a metal can, the crunch of leaves, a shadow glimpsed in the corner of my eye. I stayed by the stove, rifle across my lap, listening to the rhythm of footsteps circling. Rusty growled continuously, his fur bristling. Hours passed and then silence. The forest swallowed the sound. I was shaking, teeth chattering, sweat and cold mixing on my skin. When morning came, I found something worse than I expected. A rock had been placed deliberately on the porch, centered. Not thrown, not random set. The message was clear. Someone had been close enough to the cabin in the night to do it. I realized then I wasn't just alone in the woods. Someone was watching, maybe even tracking me. The following day, I didn't leave the cabin. I fortified what I could. I found an old crowbar under the stove, placed it by the bed. I checked the ammunition in my rifle. Rusty refused to leave my side, refusing to go near the windows or the door. I didn't sleep that night. I could hear breathing, or so I thought, just beyond the walls. The tension was unbearable, but I forced myself to stay calm. Panic wouldn't save me. On the third night, I finally understood. The noises were different this time. Deliberate, purposeful. Someone was moving not just around the cabin, but into the trees further back, testing the forest and me. I took a risk. When the steps came closest to the cabin, I flung the door open and shouted. Nothing. Silence again. But there was movement. A shadow running between trees, gone as quickly as it appeared. That was when I made my decision. I would leave at first light, pack everything, and abandon the cabin. Staying was too dangerous. Before dawn, I quietly loaded my gear, rifle in hand, Rusty at my side. I moved fast, sticking to shadows, scanning constantly. The forest seemed quieter, but I knew better. I could feel eyes on me. The gravel road appeared after what felt like hours, and finally, the truck. I jumped in, started the engine, and drove without looking back. The forest stretched endlessly on either side, thick and indifferent. It was only hours later, in a small town at a gas station, that I allowed myself to breathe. I told no one where I had been. I sold the cabin rental forfeit, leaving my money behind. Rusty, exhausted, curled in the passenger seat, but he never left my side again during the drive back. I never returned to northern Minnesota for hunting. Every now and then, though, when I'm alone at home and the wind rattles the windows, I remember that week. The dense, suffocating woods, the quiet footsteps circling a cabin, the sense of eyes everywhere. It wasn't ghosts or fairy tales. It was real. Someone had been there, and they had been patient, and they had left me alive only because I had chosen to leave first. I didn't intend to stay long in that part of rural Vermont. It was the summer of 1997, and I was 22, driving aimlessly up the winding back roads after a messy breakup, trying to get away from the noise of my life in Boston. I'd rented an old cabin through a local ad I'd found tucked in a corner of a travel guide. Nothing fancy, just a place on the edge of a tiny town called Pinebrook. The directions were sparse, but the ad promised seclusion and quiet. I hadn't thought much of it until I turned off the main road onto a gravel path that seemed to vanish into the forest. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was already low, dropping through the trees in pale, golden streaks. The place looked abandoned at first glance. Weathered wood, moss clinging to the roof, windows clouded with dirt. But there was a small, hand-painted sign by the door, "Welcome." My stomach twisted, half from relief at having found it, half from unease. Something about the cabin felt out of place, like it had been waiting for someone. The first night was uncomfortable. The cabin had no electricity, just a few oil lamps and a wood stove. I unpacked quickly, trying to shake the feeling of being watched, and lit a lamp. The forest outside was alive with the sounds of night. Distant rustlings, the occasional hoot of an owl, the snap of branches. I convinced myself it was nothing, that the unease was just my imagination running wild in the dark. It wasn't until the next morning that I noticed the graveyard. From the cabin's front porch, through a thin break in the trees, I saw the old stones leaning at odd angles, patches of white and gray mottled with lichen. It was small, maybe 20 or 30 graves at most, huddled at the edge of the forest like a secret. Some had fallen over entirely, the inscriptions faded beyond recognition. The oldest dates I could read were from the late 1800s. A thin wire fence, rusted through in parts, circled the graves, as if someone had tried to protect them decades ago but abandoned the effort. Curiosity got the better of me. I walked through the cabin yard to the edge of the graveyard, the grass brushing my legs and the air thick with the smell of wet earth. The closer I got, the more uneasy I felt. It wasn't ghost stories or old legends. It was the sheer neglect of the place, the way the graves seemed crowded together, leaning on one another as if the earth itself were trying to reclaim them. I noticed fresh footprints in the dirt near one of the graves, a thin trail of mud that hadn't hardened yet. I froze. They weren't mine. For the rest of the day, I stayed near the cabin, chopping wood, trying to distract myself. By nightfall, I had convinced myself that I just imagined the footprints. The forest noises were louder that night, and I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined someone walking outside, pausing at the graveyard, watching. The next day, I found signs of recent activity again. There were deep indentations in the soil near some of the graves, almost like someone had been digging, though nothing had been removed or buried that I could see. The thought made my stomach turn. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe local kids, maybe a groundskeeper checking the oldest stones. But the area was so isolated, there was no path from the main road that didn't take at least 20 minutes on foot. Whoever had been there had done it quietly, deliberately. I stayed inside the cabin that night, locking the door and sliding a chair under the handle. The wind rattled the windows, and every crack in the floorboards sounded like someone walking. I slept fitfully, always half awake, listening. When dawn broke, I noticed the faint smell of smoke lingering in the air, even though I hadn't lit the stove the night before. On the third day, I decided I couldn't ignore it anymore. I walked to the graveyard again, notebook in hand, to record the inscriptions, hoping that documentation would give me some sense of purpose, some rational explanation. As I moved among the stones, I realized the graveyard was larger than I'd first seen, stretching farther into the forest. Some graves had makeshift markers, pieces of wood, stones stacked unevenly, but the ones in the farther edge looked freshly dug. The soil was loose, dark, and damp, and then I saw it. A mound of dirt that hadn't been there yesterday, with a shovel sticking out of the earth beside it. I backed away slowly, heart pounding. The cabin felt miles away through the thick forest. Whoever had been digging had clearly left in a hurry, but I couldn't shake the feeling they were still nearby, hidden in the trees. I ran back to the cabin, slammed the door, and barricaded it with whatever I could find. For hours, I just sat there listening. There were noises outside, branches snapping, leaves rustling, but nothing tangible. The forest seemed alive, patient, and calculating. The fourth day brought a chilling realization. I found fresh footprints again, but this time they led up to the cabin itself. They stopped at the edge of the porch. Someone had been here looking inside, and I hadn't noticed it. Panic set in, but I had to think clearly. I remembered a tip from a survival article. Leave a note somewhere visible from the road if you need help. I wrote a brief message, placed it in a plastic bag to protect it from the rain, and set it under a rock near the end of the driveway where it might be seen by anyone passing by. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I kept the lamps burning, knives at the ready. At some point, I think I dozed for an hour, waking to the sound of scraping on the cabin door. Whoever it was had been circling, testing it, trying to see if I was inside. My mind raced. This wasn't a storybook horror. This was real danger. I had no idea who it was or what they wanted, only that they were using the graveyard as cover, as a shield, while they watched. The next morning, a truck came down the road. A local farmer, judging by the mud on the tires and the smell of livestock. I waved frantically, shouting, and he pulled over. When I told him about the footprints and the digging, his face hardened. He explained that some townsfolk had long suspected illegal activity near that old graveyard. Sometimes people would bury stolen livestock or dump evidence of petty crimes. Nobody went near it at night because it was remote and easy to hide in. He offered to check with the sheriff and gave me a ride back to town. By the time I returned weeks later to retrieve my belongings from the cabin, the mound of dirt I had seen was gone. The ground had been flattened, the shovels removed. Local authorities had fenced off the graveyard, placing signs that warned against trespassing. I never learned exactly who had been digging those graves or why, but the fear I felt during those nights never left me. I still think about it sometimes, the way silence in the forest can feel like a presence, the way empty spaces can hide more than just the past. I never stayed in a remote cabin again, and I avoid graveyards at night. But that experience taught me something I hadn't expected. Danger doesn't need ghosts or monsters to exist. It can be quiet, slow, patient, and it can hide in plain sight, waiting for someone foolish enough to wander into the wrong place at the wrong time. I had always dreamed of escaping the city, of building something of my own far from the endless hum of traffic and the constant glare of neon signs. So, in the fall of 2003, I drove north from my small apartment in Manchester to a patch of land I had bought 2 summers earlier. I was 27, broke but stubbornly determined. The land was in Cumbria, nestled deep in the foothills of the Lake District, accessible only by a rough, muddy track that wound its way through dense, wet woodland. When I first saw it, The air smelled of moss and earth, and the sky hung low and gray, the kind of heavy sky that promised rain. That was perfect. Rain meant I could test my little cabin's makeshift roof early. The cabin itself wasn't much. I had planned it on my own, using secondhand timber and salvaged materials from a demolition site near Manchester. It was a small, single-room structure, maybe 12 feet by 10, with a steeply pitched roof. I had built it over the summer, sweating under the sun, lifting heavy planks, hammering nails, and learning painfully that timber never lies flat. I remember the day I finally lifted the last ridge beam into place. My arms shook, my back ached, but there was something solid and permanent about it. I could finally call it mine. It was late October when I decided to spend my first night there. The sky had turned heavy and oppressive in the afternoon, clouds thickening until the wind started to stir, whistling through the trees. By evening, it was raining hard, sheets of water bouncing off the old tin roof I had managed to salvage, creating a rhythmic, almost hypnotic drumming inside the cabin. The wood smelled damp, the air thick with the scent of wet earth and rotting leaves. I stacked some dry logs I had collected near the front door, built a small fire in the cast iron stove I had managed to find on eBay, and settled in with a thin blanket and a tin mug of tea. The first thing I noticed that night was how alive the rain made everything feel. The cabin itself, though small and crude, felt like a shelter in the truest sense, cocooning me from the storm. Outside, the wind tore through the trees with a low, haunting howl. Branches thrashed against each other, sending showers of leaves into the muddy ground. The rain fell so hard at times that I couldn't see the land around me. The window panes fogged with condensation, and the drops ran in rivulets down the glass. I could hear the soil softening under the weight of the water, and somewhere in the distance, a trickle of water ran into what must have been a swollen stream. I had intended to spend the night quietly, maybe read a book by the fire, but the storm seemed to have other ideas. Around 10, the wind picked up, rattling the cabin violently. I could hear the wood of the walls groaning, a low, continuous creak that made me sit up straighter. I tried to remind myself that the structure was solid, that I had reinforced the corners with metal brackets and cross beams, but my muscles tensed with every loud bang. The forest around me felt huge, unbroken, and utterly indifferent. Every time a branch cracked or a distant tree fell with a dull thud, I could feel it reverberate through the floorboards. Hours passed like that. I could barely tell the difference between one loud gust and the next, between one crash of rain and the constant patter of water against the roof. Occasionally, lightning would split the sky, bright enough to paint the trees in stark, eerie shadows. The thunder rolled long after the flash, a low, menacing growl that seemed to fill the hills around me. I realized how utterly alone I was. There was no other cabin for miles. The nearest farmhouse was at least a 2-hour walk through mud and undergrowth, and the nearest road was an hour beyond that. My cell phone had no signal, not that I had bothered to check until now. The thought that something might go wrong, and that no one could come, gnawed at the edges of my resolve. Around midnight, the storm shifted. It didn't get worse, but the pattern of the wind changed, as though it had learned the contours of the land. A steady, insistent tapping started on the roof, not from rain, but from something heavier, perhaps a mix of hail and falling branches. I got up, pulled on my raincoat, and stepped outside onto the small, muddy porch I had built. The night was almost black, the only light coming from the cabin and occasional lightning flashes. The ground was slick, and every step I took left deep impressions in the mud. I could see my fire flickering through the window, smoke curling upward into the storm, but it was useless out here. I had come outside because the tapping had grown too close, too deliberate. It was then that I noticed something odd. Near the edge of the clearing, where the trees grew denser, a tree had split, its top crashing down into the undergrowth with a wet, splintering sound. The rain had softened the soil around it, and the whole tree had leaned dangerously close to the cabin, resting partially on other smaller trees. I realized that if the wind shifted again, that massive weight could come down on the roof. My heart pounded. I ran back inside, my boots squelching in the mud, and grabbed my saw and some rope. I couldn't risk waiting for the morning. I had to secure it before it fell completely. For the next hour, I worked in the cold, the rain soaking me through. I rigged a series of ropes to the remaining trees, trying to support the leaning mass just enough that it wouldn't collapse entirely. My hands were raw, my fingers numb, but I worked methodically, testing knots and angles, listening to the wind and the rain. By the time I was done, the worst of the leaning weight was held at bay, suspended just enough to make the cabin safe for the night. I collapsed on the floor, exhausted, shivering, but with a faint sense of accomplishment. I had survived the storm's first test. By dawn, the rain had eased to a drizzle, and the wind had mostly died down. The cabin smelled of wet wood and smoke, and I realized I hadn't slept properly. My body ached in ways I didn't think possible. I walked outside, surveying the aftermath. The forest floor was littered with branches, some stripped bare by the wind, and puddles had formed everywhere. Mud coated the cabin's steps, and the small creek that ran nearby had swollen beyond its banks. Yet, despite the destruction, the cabin stood, solid, stubborn.
Mine.
I had learned, in those long, terrifying hours, not just about the unpredictability of nature, but also about my own resilience. I stayed another week, repairing the damage and strengthening weak points I hadn't noticed before. Every night brought storms, but I faced them with a growing confidence. By the time I left to return to Manchester, the cabin felt permanent, not just a shelter, but a testament to my own ability to endure, to survive without anyone else. The experience stayed with me for years. The memory of wind and rain and the wet smell of wood in a storm etched into my mind. And whenever I think of that night, I don't remember fear as much as I remember the clarity of knowing I could rely entirely on myself. That small, battered cabin in the rain had taught me more than any city apartment ever could. I retired from the force 3 years ago, long enough to feel the urge for quiet, but not long enough to forget the instincts that had defined me for over 25 years. By then, my bones ached in ways the gym couldn't fix, and the city streets felt smaller, tighter, more suffocating than I remembered. That's why, in the summer of 2018, I found myself on a rickety riverboat, winding through the Amazon. I was 58, a retired cop named Frank Dawson, and I was chasing solitude. A cabin that someone had promised was off the grid. The cabin itself wasn't anything spectacular, just weathered wood and a tin roof, tucked in a clearing so dense with foliage it felt like nature had swallowed it whole. I had arranged for a guide, someone local, but they left me at the edge of the clearing at sunrise with a small pack of supplies and a wave. I had my survival gear, a machete, and my old service pistol. Never could shake the habit of carrying something that might keep me alive. My Labrador, Max, trotted ahead, ears alert, nose to the ground, a shadow of vigilance I recognized instantly. The first day passed uneventfully. I set up my modest campsite near the cabin, chopped firewood, and made a stew from rice, beans, and a few preserved vegetables I had packed. The air was thick and humid, the kind of heat that clung to your skin and made every movement a small struggle. Birds called out from the trees, and insects buzzed incessantly, a white noise that became strangely comforting. I sat on a log with Max beside me, listening to the forest breathe, feeling a rare calm. The real trouble began the following afternoon. I had gone down a narrow path to a small creek to refill my water bottle. The forest canopy was dense, and the light that trickled through painted everything in sharp, green patterns. Max was ahead, sniffing, but he suddenly froze, growling low. I followed his gaze and saw movement, human movement. A man, mid-30s, thin, wearing clothes that had clearly seen better days, emerging from the foliage. He didn't speak, just stared, and my instincts kicked in immediately. I stepped back slowly, hand brushing against my pistol. The man retreated into the trees as quickly as he appeared, disappearing like a shadow swallowed by the dense undergrowth. My heart hammered. Something about the way he moved, his silence, the sheer audacity of appearing uninvited in the middle of the Amazon, set every warning bell in my brain ringing. I returned to the cabin cautiously, keeping Max close, scanning the tree line for any sign of the man. Nothing. That night, I slept fitfully. Every snap of a branch, every rustle of leaves, made me jump. Max was restless too, ears twitching, growling at shadows I couldn't see. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was just a local hunter or a scavenger, but my gut told me otherwise. There was a tension in the air, a quiet I hadn't felt before. Morning didn't bring relief. When I stepped outside, I found footprints around the cabin. Not animal prints, human. They circled the cabin like someone had been watching me, studying me, waiting. My pulse quickened. I spent hours tracing the path, noting how the prints led into the thick forest and vanished. Whoever had been there had knowledge of the terrain, could move silently, and wasn't afraid of confronting me. The thought made my old cop instincts flare. I was trained to recognize patterns, and this was a deliberate approach. Over the next few days, I fortified the cabin. I reinforced the doors with branches and logs, set up a perimeter with simple traps to alert me if someone came close, and made sure Max and I had a clear line of sight in every direction. I started moving silently, listening, always scanning the trees. I even slept with my pistol within arm's reach. The tension was unrelenting. Every night, I heard rustling outside, sometimes right at the edge of the clearing, then nothing. Whoever it was, they were patient, methodical. Then it escalated. On the fifth night, I awoke to a sharp crack, a branch breaking just beyond the clearing. Max barked furiously, but even he seemed uncertain. I grabbed my flashlight and swept it over the tree-line. A shadow moved, tall, thin, and fast. It stopped, frozen in place for a moment, then vanished into the darkness. I knew then this wasn't random. This was deliberate intimidation. Whoever it was wanted me to feel trapped, isolated. And it was working. I considered leaving. The nearest river landing was 2 days away on foot. But something in me, that stubborn mix of police training and survival instinct, wouldn't allow it. I had to see this through, understand who or what was targeting me. I spent the next day setting up tripwires and noise traps made from cans and stones, things that would give me an early warning if someone entered the clearing. I stayed alert, moving quietly, listening to the rhythm of the forest. Night came again. Hours passed. The forest seemed alive with anticipation. And then a sound, a deliberate, soft crunching of leaves, approaching from the south side of the cabin. Max growled, low and steady. I gripped my pistol, crouched behind the cabin's outer wall. I could see a shadow creeping through the undergrowth. Paused. The air felt thick, heavy, oppressive. My heart pounded in my chest, but I forced myself to remain silent, waiting for the right moment. The man, or whatever he was, stepped into the clearing. I caught sight of his face under the dim moonlight. Thin, sharp features, eyes that were cold and calculating. He had a knife strapped to his side. I knew I couldn't let him close. I took a slow step forward, letting my presence be known. A flash of recognition, maybe fear, crossed his face. He bolted, heading deeper into the forest, leaving a trail of disturbed leaves and broken twigs behind him. I didn't chase him. I knew better. Instead, I spent the next morning packing essentials into a waterproof bag. I followed the river path back to the nearest settlement, keeping Max close. The village elders warned me that some men in the region were known to intimidate outsiders for sport, testing their nerves and courage. They explained that the forest provided cover for these opportunists, who relied on fear rather than confrontation. I realized that's exactly what I had faced. Someone trying to assert control without ever showing weakness. By the time we reached the small dock, my nerves were frayed, my body exhausted, but there was relief too. I had survived, had kept Max safe, and had left the forest with every lesson it had offered. The cabin, once a symbol of solitude, had become a test of vigilance, patience, and mental endurance. I knew I wouldn't return, not because of fear, but because I had taken all I could from that experience. Weeks later, back home in my small apartment, I could still feel the weight of the Amazon pressing against my chest. I kept Max close, but the tension had eased. I started documenting everything, writing detailed notes of my observations, almost like a personal training manual. I had faced danger alone, relied on instincts honed over decades, and walked away unscathed. That, in itself, was a victory. I never saw the man again, and I hoped he never found the cabin again either. But every now and then, when I close my eyes and listen to the night in the city, I can hear the Amazon, the subtle rustling, the distant call of wildlife, and the faint echo of footsteps that weren't mine. It's a reminder that even in retirement, the world is bigger and darker than the streets I once patrolled. And some lessons, learned under the dense canopy of the forest, stay with you forever. I never thought I'd be the kind of person to get caught up in something like that. Back in the summer of 2003, I was 36, recently divorced, and trying to escape the suffocating buzz of New York City. I had spent most of my life on streets full of noise, neon lights, and people always in a rush, and it had left me exhausted, hollow. My plan was simple: a 2-week retreat in a small, rustic cabin somewhere deep in the Adirondacks. Just me, my old backpack, and a cooler of food. I needed quiet, something untouched by the world, where I could breathe without hearing a car horn or a siren every 5 minutes. I drove up north in my old Subaru, the kind that had more miles than sense, the radio playing static between stations as I passed endless stretches of forest. The cabin was located near a small lake called Mirror Lake, a name that now makes me shiver just thinking about it. It was nothing fancy. 2 rooms, a small kitchen with a wood stove, and a tiny porch overlooking the water. There was no electricity, no running water beyond a well, and cell service barely reached the edge of the forest. I didn't care. In fact, that was exactly why I chose it. The first day was peaceful. I unpacked my few belongings, stacked firewood against the cabin wall, and wandered along the shoreline. The water was still, reflective like glass, and the only sounds were the occasional splash of a fish and the distant caw of a crow. At night, the sky stretched in a dome of stars, clearer than I had ever seen in the city. I felt free. By the 3rd day, something felt slightly off. It started with small things. The trail I had used to reach the cabin had faint, almost imperceptible marks, like someone had been walking through the woods recently. Not animal tracks, human. I told myself it was probably a hunter or a local wandering through. The cabin was old. Perhaps someone had used it before me. But there was no one around. No cars, no voices, just me and the forest. On the 4th night, the real unease began. I was lying in bed, the wooden floor creaking as I shifted under my blanket. That's when I heard it. A soft scraping, like nails across wood, coming from the back of the cabin. At first, I thought it was a branch brushing against the roof, but the sound repeated, deliberate, moving closer to the window. My pulse quickened. I grabbed a flashlight, slowly unhooked the screen from the window, and peered out. Nothing, just the trees, swaying in the wind, and the lake reflecting the moonlight. I tried to tell myself I was imagining things, that isolation was making my mind play tricks, but sleep that night was impossible. Every rustle, every snap of a twig made me flinch. The next morning, I went for a walk along the far side of the lake. That's when I noticed footprints in the mud, fresh, human-sized. They weren't mine. They led from the woods to the cabin, and I realized with a cold knot in my stomach that someone had been there while I was asleep. No one in the small town nearby could have known I was coming, I thought. I didn't leave a trail of announcements. My stomach churned, and I made my way back quickly, constantly scanning the tree line for movement. I decided to spend the next day preparing for the worst. I reinforced the doors with extra planks from the firewood pile, checked the windows to make sure they were locked, and even tied a rope around the back door handle in case someone tried to open it. I filled the bathtub with water, just in case, and stacked more firewood near the windows. I felt a strange mix of paranoia and determination. I was alone in the wilderness, but I wasn't going to be helpless. Night fell, and the forest came alive in a way I had never heard before. Owls called, branches cracked, and the wind whistled through the treetops. Then I heard it again, that scraping, slow, methodical, coming from the back of the cabin. My heart jumped into my throat. I grabbed the old hunting knife I had brought and moved to the window. Through the glass, I could barely make out a shadow moving between the trees. I didn't see a face, didn't hear a voice, but I knew. I just knew. Someone was out there, watching. I stayed awake all night. Every sound made me flinch. Every shadow made me tense. The first light, I dared to step outside. The footprints were still there, circling the cabin, stopping right at my back door. Whoever it was, they hadn't entered, but the message was clear. They knew I was here, and they were daring me to do something. My stomach turned as I realized how isolated I was. I couldn't run to a neighbor, couldn't call the police reliably, couldn't trust my car to start if they were waiting. Over the next few days, I became hyper-aware. I never went far from the cabin, never left the door unlocked, and slept with the knife under my pillow. I would see fleeting glimpses through the trees, a flash of movement, a shadow ducking behind a trunk. Once, I saw a figure standing on the opposite shore of the lake, just watching. I froze for an hour, paralyzed, before it vanished. The sense of being hunted was oppressive. I started rationing my food, keeping extra firewood stacked near the door, and I even dug small pits around the perimeter, thinking of some primitive way to defend myself. On the 7th day, the tension reached its peak. I woke before dawn to the sound of footsteps on the porch. They were slow, deliberate, and heavier than mine. My heart pounded so hard I could hear it in my ears. I reached for the knife, then heard something that made my stomach drop. The scratching sound at the back door. I waited, holding my breath, frozen. Then, almost imperceptibly, a small metallic click. The lock on the door, I had forgotten to double-check it last night, was turning. I sprang into action. I grabbed the knife, bolted to the back door, and flung it open. The forest behind me was empty. No shadow, no footprints, nothing. Just the wind in the trees and the soft lapping of water against the shore. I stumbled outside, searching the perimeter. Then I noticed it. An old, abandoned camper van parked far in the trees, hidden from the cabin until now. Its tires were caked in mud, and the driver's side door was slightly ajar. Someone had been living there, watching me, moving silently through the forest, and they had retreated when I woke. I didn't sleep again that night. By morning, I packed everything into the car and drove straight back to the nearest town. I didn't stop, didn't look back, and called the sheriff from the first place with a working phone. They came to investigate the cabin and the abandoned van. There were no arrests, but they found evidence that someone had been living off-grid near the lake for months, breaking into the cabin whenever it was empty. Supplies, discarded cans, makeshift bedding. I never went back. It's been 22 years now, and I still think about that summer. That cabin, that forest, the way it felt to know someone was just beyond the trees, unseen, silent, patient. I don't think I'll ever return to the Adirondacks, and I'll never forget the sound of scraping nails on wood, or the shadows moving between the trees in the pre-dawn light. The real terror, I learned, isn't ghosts or monsters. It's knowing that another person is out there unseen, and that they could be watching you, waiting, and you're completely at their mercy. Even now, if I see an abandoned cabin in the woods while driving, I feel that old knot tighten in my stomach. That cabin taught me something I will never forget. Nature is beautiful, but it's also indifferent. And humans? Humans can be far more frightening than any storm, any bear, or any dark night. I had always been a city man, the kind who measured life by the hum of traffic lights and the clatter of subways. But after turning 60, retired from 35 years in law enforcement, I felt an ache in my bones for silence, for air that didn't smell of exhaust and grime. That's how I ended up driving a rattling old pickup truck through the Montana wilderness in the fall of 1998, my Labrador, Rex, riding shotgun. My destination was a small, weather-beaten cabin I had rented through a local caretaker, tucked in a remote valley, far from any road you could call paved. The road ended abruptly at a narrow dirt track that disappeared into the forest. I parked, the truck's engine groaning in protest, and Rex leapt out, sniffing the pine-scented air. I grabbed the duffel with my supplies. Canned food, a couple of blankets, a cast-iron skillet, and a small toolbox. The caretaker had told me the cabin was self-sufficient, but the last mile to it involved a rough hike over roots and loose stones. By the time I reached the clearing where the cabin sat, a low orange sun was spilling across the ridge tops, and shadows already clung to the thick pines. The cabin was small, built from logs that had darkened over decades. Its windows were dusty, and the wooden porch sagged slightly in the center. I set down my gear, listening as Rex padded around the perimeter, his tail alert. There was a stillness here that felt alive, almost watchful. I shook it off as the nerves of a man who hadn't touched a real forest in decades. Inside, the cabin smelled of old wood, moss, and the faint tang of smoke from a long and used stove. Dust motes floated in the beams of fading sunlight through the grimy windows. I dropped my duffel near the door and walked through the rooms. There was a small kitchen area, a tiny bedroom with a sagging mattress, and a loft that could hold another person or maybe two, if they didn't mind being cramped. Everything creaked as I moved. The caretaker had left a box of firewood stacked near the stove, and I set to building a small fire. The snap and hiss of the wood coming alive under the flames brought a comforting warmth to the room, and I felt a sense of satisfaction. This was isolation in its rawest form, and for a moment I relished it. As darkness fell, the forest outside became a shifting mass of shadows. Rex lay near the fire, ears twitching at every distant snap of a twig. The wind stirred the pines, making the cabin groan as if it were a living thing. That first night, sleep came fitfully. Every small noise seemed magnified. A branch scratching against the roof, leaves scraping the siding, the occasional distant cry of an animal. I told myself it was all natural, the sound of a forest at night, but the hairs on my arms refused to lie down. The next morning, I decided to explore. Rex bounded ahead, nose to the ground. I followed a faint trail that led down to a creek, its water clear and fast, reflecting the morning light. As I knelt to take a drink, I noticed something odd. Fresh tire tracks nearby, heading away from the cabin into the deeper woods. They were wide, made by a heavy vehicle, maybe a truck like mine. I couldn't imagine anyone else venturing out here, at least not this late in the season. A shiver went down my spine, but I shrugged it off, focusing instead on the serenity of the place. By the third day, the isolation had begun to press on me. I was fine during the day, walking the trails, checking the creek, gathering kindling. But as night fell, the feeling of being watched grew. Not ghosts or spirits, nothing supernatural, just the primal unease that comes when you are completely alone in a vast forest. On that night, I woke to Rex growling softly. At first, I thought it was another animal, a raccoon or a fox, but then I heard it. The distinct crunch of footsteps on the dirt path outside. Slow, deliberate, heavy. Not the sound of someone lost. My pulse spiked. I grabbed the old baseball bat I had brought for emergencies, trying to steady my shaking hands. The footsteps circled the cabin. I could hear them stop, then resume, moving around the structure. There was a faint rustling, like someone dragging a bag or a bundle through the underbrush. I didn't dare look out the window, didn't dare light a lamp. I waited, barely breathing. Hours passed. Eventually, the noises faded. The forest returned to its normal rhythm, or what passed for normal here. I didn't sleep that night. Morning brought no relief. I decided to investigate the tracks I had noticed earlier. They weren't mine. They led to a small clearing about half a mile from the cabin. There, I found a battered tent, long abandoned, its fabric shredded by wind and wildlife. Near it, the ground had been disturbed, as if someone had dug or buried something, though it was too hard to tell. The thought that someone else had been lurking in the area, maybe watching the cabin, made my stomach twist. I wasn't afraid of the forest itself. I dealt with dangerous people before, but the thought of someone using this wilderness as cover made me deeply uneasy. I returned to the cabin, setting traps and barricading doors as best as I could. I used nails to reinforce the old wooden latches and stacked some heavy boxes against the back door. That night, I didn't even attempt to sleep in the bed. I curled up on the floor with Rex, listening to every sound outside. Hours passed, each one heavier than the last. The forest seemed endless, a living entity surrounding the cabin, and I realized that even years on the force, I wasn't used to feeling so completely powerless. By the fifth day, the situation became clearer. I spotted someone at the edge of the tree line in the distance, crouched low, moving with purpose. Whoever it was, they weren't casual hikers. I could see the glint of something metallic in the morning sun, maybe a tool or weapon. I didn't panic. Instead, I kept watch, noting patterns, timing movements. I didn't have communication with the outside world, no cell signal, but I had survival skills. I made sure the fire was low so as not to signal my position, and I prepared to make a controlled retreat if necessary. That evening, the person came closer, clearly scoping the cabin. I waited until they turned away, then I packed essentials. A bag with food, water, and tools and slipped out the back, staying low and moving with the shadows. Rex followed silently. We hiked down the ridge, through thick underbrush, following the creek downstream. The forest seemed quieter now, almost cautious, as if it had taken notice of our departure. After a long, exhausting trek, we reached a logging road. A passing truck gave me a lift back to the nearest town, where I contacted the caretaker. He confessed later that there had been reports of squatters in the area, men who lived in the woods and had occasionally threatened visitors. I realized how lucky I had been. Not a ghost or fairy tale, just the harsh reality of people exploiting isolation. The experience left me changed. I still loved the forest, but I learned a lesson about respect. For the wilderness, yes, but also for the people who move unseen within it. I returned home to the city, to the hum of traffic and lights, feeling an odd sense of relief. I had faced fear in its rawest, most human form, and survived not because of luck alone, but because I stayed alert, respected my instincts, and trusted my own experience. Rex curled up at my feet as I sank into the couch, and for the first time in days, I felt completely safe. It was the summer of 1998, and I was 29, working as a park ranger in the dense backwoods of northern Montana. I had been stationed at Black Pine National Park for about 2 years, mostly patrolling trails and keeping an eye on campers. The park itself was quiet compared to the busy Yellowstone region to the south, but its silence could be deceiving. People often came for solitude, but the forest had its own rhythms, some of which I didn't fully understand yet. My cabin was small and isolated, built on the edge of a pine grove overlooking a shallow creek. It was nothing fancy, just a single room with a wood stove, a small bed, and a desk where I kept the park logs. Electricity was limited, coming from a small generator I had to run every few hours, and water came from a hand-pumped well behind the cabin. Suited me fine. I liked the quiet, the feeling that the forest belonged to me alone when I was on duty. That week, a heat wave had settled over the region. The air was dry, the pine needles crisp underfoot, and the fire danger was high. Rangers were on alert, constantly checking trails for careless campers or signs of smoke. I had spent the afternoon walking the perimeter of the northern section, taking my time, noting where hikers had left trash or made improper campfires. By the time I returned to my cabin, the sun was low, spilling gold and orange across the treetops. I could feel the forest shifting as shadows lengthened. I dropped my backpack, hung my rifle on the wall, and started the generator for a hot shower. My dog, Boomer, a lean, dark-coated shepherd mix, trotted in circles, tail wagging, excited I was home. He was 7 years old but still energetic, a perfect companion for a ranger working alone. After the shower, I fixed a simple dinner of beans and rice, staring out the window at the creek. The water sparkled in the last light, and a few birds flitted between branches. That night, the forest felt different, not menacing but tense. I went through my usual routine, checked the doors, counted my supplies, and wrote a quick log of my day. By 10 p.m., I settled into bed, Boomer at my feet, the faint hum of the generator and the occasional hoot of an owl the only sounds. At around midnight, I woke to a subtle noise, something that didn't fit the usual sounds of the forest. At first, I thought it was just an animal, a raccoon or maybe a deer, but then it repeated, a faint scraping like someone dragging a heavy branch across the dirt near the cabin. My heart rate quickened, but I told myself it was probably just the wind knocking something over outside. I grabbed my flashlight and slipped on my boots, keeping my rifle close. The night was moonless, and the beam from my flashlight cut through the thick shadows. I moved slowly around the cabin, scanning the trees, the creek, the undergrowth. Nothing. Just the occasional rustle of small animals. I checked the windows and doors, they were secure. Boomer growled softly, his hackles raised, staring into the darkness behind the cabin. That made my skin prickle. I tried to go back to bed, thinking maybe I was overreacting, but the noise returned, louder this time, scraping, crunching underbrush. It was coming from the north, the side of the cabin that backed onto the denser part of the forest. I grabbed my rifle, loaded it, and stepped outside with Boomer. The air was dry, and every step I took made the dead pine needles crack sharply. The scraping stopped. I circled the cabin, shining the light into the trees. My ears picked up a faint snapping in the brush, something moving deliberately, quietly. Whoever or whatever it was knew I was outside. The rational part of my mind tried to dismiss it, maybe a lost hiker or poacher. But something about the movement, slow and deliberate, set off every instinct I had as a ranger. The night stretched long. I spent hours outside, circling the cabin, listening. Boomer stayed close, occasionally barking when a branch broke too sharply. I noticed that the generator had sputtered and died at some point, leaving me in near-complete darkness. I could hear nothing now except the wind in the pines and the soft flow of the creek. Then, a sound came that froze me. A low, dragging sound against the cabin's siding, like someone was trying to lift a window or pry the door. I froze, listening. My heart was pounding in my ears. Slowly, I moved to the front door, rifle raised. Boomer growled, backing up slightly, hackles raised. I pressed myself against the door, straining to hear. The dragging stopped, then came a faint whisper of movement away from the cabin, down the trail leading north. Whoever it was had moved. I stayed by the door the rest of the night, flashlight and rifle in hand, refusing to sleep. When the first light of dawn broke through the pines, I could see tracks in the dirt around the cabin. Heavy boots. They led from the tree line to the north side of the cabin and back again, stopping short of the door. Whoever had been there hadn't tried to break in, but they had come close enough to be dangerous. I radioed the ranger station. A pair of colleagues drove up within an hour, and we combed the area. Nothing was found, no one hiding, no gear, nothing. Just the tracks, fading into the forest. The day passed slowly. I stayed near the cabin, setting up motion sensors and extra tripwires along the north perimeter. By the evening, I had started to relax slightly, though the sense of unease never fully left me. That night, I kept a fire burning and slept lightly in shifts with Boomer. No one came. The following morning, after reporting the tracks to park headquarters, I joined 2 other rangers for a full sweep of the northern section. It took the better part of the day, but we eventually discovered the source of the intrusions. A small group of campers had set up an illegal campsite several miles into the restricted area. They had been moving toward the cabin at night, probably looking to scavenge supplies or just spy on someone living alone. We found makeshift traps, discarded bottles, and evidence that they had been there for a week. It was unsettling, but also a relief. No ghost, no mystical force, just humans, and humans could be dealt with. We escorted the campers out, filed the reports, and I returned to my cabin. I spent the next few nights double-checking security, making sure the windows were reinforced and the perimeter clear. Boomer seemed calmer too, sensing the immediate danger had passed. By the end of that week, the heat wave had broken. The forest smelled fresh after a brief rain, and the park was quiet again. I finally slept through the night, knowing the real threat was gone, and I could resume my routine. Sitting by the creek the next morning, watching sunlight shimmer on the water, I realized how vulnerable those woods could make you feel when alone, but also how much preparation and vigilance could keep you safe. The experience changed me. I became more meticulous about security, more aware of sounds in the forest, more attuned to the signs of human activity. The woods could be terrifying, yes, but it was never about ghosts or shadows. It was about real danger, and knowing the terrain, your tools, and your instincts could make the difference between fear and survival. I kept that lesson with me for the rest of my career, and whenever I look back at the cabin in Black Pine, I remember the summer of 1998 as the one that taught me that fear in the forest was always grounded in reality, and that reality, when respected, could be managed.